Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thanks again for meeting over Zoom instead of in person. Unfortunately, as of last Friday, the day after last class, I came down with symptoms. I'm sure I caught it from my wife. So I can't be in person right now. I was hoping I'd be better for Thursday's class, but I'm still having symptoms. So just out of an abundance of caution, we're gonna have Thursday's class over Zoom as well, because the last thing I want to do is get anybody sick. So today and Thursday will be over Zoom. We're going to be back in class next week. So starting on Tuesday, 1 week from today, we're going to be back in class barring some sort of emergency. Okay, so expect to be back in class on Tuesday. I'll send out another email with another link for Thursday's class. I'm recording this lecture, so I will also be emailing a link. I'll be uploading this to YouTube, and I'll be emailing everybody a link to it as well. I'm doing okay. My symptoms are fairly mild. I'm just coughing a lot and I'm having to clear my throat a lot. So if I'm doing that throughout the lecture, that's why. It's because of COVID. I apologize for that, but I'll try to keep that to a minimum. Okay, in any case, we've got about 2 or 3 slides left in the persuasion section to finish before we move on to a different topic. So let's do that. Okay, so last class, we were talking about persuasion, and in particular, we were talking about the elaboration likelihood model, which says that people can be persuaded along one of 2 different routes. If you're on the central route to persuasion, that means you're being that you're motivated to think in depth about a message, and that means that you're paying attention to the strength of the arguments, and you don't really care about anything else. And if you're on the peripheral route to persuasion, that's because you're not really motivated to think in depth about an issue for a variety of reasons. And if you're on the peripheral route, you're not analyzing the strength of the arguments, but instead you're going to be more influenced by more sort of superficial factors. Excuse me. Okay. I want to talk just briefly, though, about some research that's looked at resisting persuasion. And in particular, I want to start by talking about a phenomenon known as attitude inoculation. Attitude inoculation is kind of a psychological analog to how vaccines work. So you know that when you get injected with a vaccine, then what you're doing, you're being injected with like a dead version, or at least a very much weakened version of the virus you're being vaccinated against, with the idea being that if you're injected with like a very weak version of the virus, your body will produce these antibodies so that when you come across a real version of that virus, your body's already prepared to fight it off. And the same principle sort of applies at a psychological level as well. What I mean by that is that if you expose someone to a weak version of an argument prior to exposing them to the real argument, the strongest version of an argument, exposing them to that weak version of the argument makes them less persuadable later on. Let me explain what I mean. And I'll do so by describing a study. There's a study a while ago where they talked about, or someone was coming in to give a talk to high school students about raising the legal driving age from 16 to 18. And they randomly assigned these students to one of 2 conditions. For half of the students, they did not know what the talk was going to be about. So the speaker just came on stage and immediately started talking about why we wanted to raise the legal driving age. For the other half of the students, prior to that speaker coming on and giving that talk, about 10 minutes prior to that, the students were told in general what the speaker was going to be talking about. They were told the speaker was going to come on in 10 minutes and try to convince them why the legal driving age should be raised from 16 to 18. Then they got the exact same talk the other students got. Okay. At the end of that talk, all of the students were questioned about their attitudes, whether they agreed with the speaker about raising the legal driving age from 16 to 18. And among the students who had received no prior warning, those students were persuaded by the speaker. They came to agree with the benefits of raising the legal driving age from 16 to 18. But for the group of students who had been forewarned, who had 10 minutes prior to the talk been told what the speaker was going to try to persuade them of, those students didn't come to agree with the speaker. The speaker lost his persuasive appeal to those students. So being exposed to a weak version of an argument, in this case, that means a weak version just means being told what the speaker was going to talk about, buffered them from those later persuasion attempts. And this happens for a couple of different reasons. First off, those students who were forewarned, they were given basically 10 minutes to come up with a series of counter arguments, right? They had 10 minutes to prepare in their minds reasons why we shouldn't raise the legal driving age from 16 to 18. As a consequence, when the speaker came on to give their talk, they had already come up with reasons to counteract the speaker, right? As a consequence, they were harder to persuade, whereas the students who didn't know what the speaker was going to be talking about obviously weren't able to generate those counter arguments, so they were more persuadable. And a second reason it works is that there's sort of this motivational reaction that occurs when someone tells you they're going to try to change your opinion. And you can imagine this. If I told you, for instance, that in 10 minutes from now, I was going to try to change your political beliefs or your religious beliefs or your moral beliefs or whatever it is, right? There's kind of the sense in which you would say like, oh yeah, you just try me. You just try to change me. And the reason for that is because we like to feel like we're in control of ourselves. We don't like to feel that we're easily manipulated by other people. So if you know that someone's trying to change your opinion, we have this tendency to steel ourselves, to make us harder to persuade, to sort of prove that we're in control of our own fates. And that motivational reaction is something known as psychological reactance. Here's officially what psychological reactance is. Okay? We like to feel that we are free to choose to do whatever we want to do, that we can make our own choices. And when we feel that someone is threatening our freedom to choose to do something, we really don't like that. We react against that perceived threat to our freedoms. And we'll often do that by moving our opinion in the exact opposite direction than the speaker wanted. And so what that means is that if someone's trying to persuade you of something, their attempts to persuade you might backfire if their attempts to persuade you are perceived as you taking away a freedom, or I should say, of the speaker taking away one of your freedoms. In order to prove that you're an individual, you might come to the exact opposite conclusion than the speaker's trying to persuade you of, because that sort of allows you to re-exert your freedoms. And that basic idea is captured in this cartoon, which is labeled The Essence of Human Nature. And this is basically psychological reactance in a nutshell. It's a man who's standing with his wife beside a sign that says absolutely no machete juggling. And he says, suddenly I have an urge to juggle machetes. Now, he didn't have that urge to juggle machetes until someone told him, or until the sign told him he's not allowed to do it. Now, he didn't want to do it in the first place, right? But because he felt like that sign was impinging on his freedom to choose if he wanted to juggle machetes, he reacted against it. He experienced psychological reactance, and he developed this urge to juggle machetes. Okay. And someone asked in the chat, can you please explain the counter argument point again? So I believe you're talking about, on the previous slide, right? This is the idea that if you are given a warning, like a heads up, if you're given 10 minutes or 15 minutes, and you're told that in 10 minutes, someone's going to try to change your opinion, someone's going to try to persuade you. If you're told that, then you're given an extra 10 minutes to generate counter arguments to what the speaker is going to try to persuade you of. So by the time the speaker comes on and tries to persuade you, you've already got counter arguments to what the speaker is about to tell you. And this psychological reactance, this feeling that we re-exert freedoms that we feel are being taken away from us. We see this in a whole bunch of real world situations. And you might have experienced this yourself. So if you imagine when you were, let's say in high school, let's say you're living at home with your parents, right? And let's say you're in some sort of dating relationship. And if your parents didn't approve of the person that you were dating, you might have experienced this tendency to sort of try to prove your parents wrong, right? In other words, if our parents are telling us you're not allowed to date this person, we don't like the fact that we're not in control of our own lives. Someone else is telling us what to do, which makes us want to date that person even more, right? And there's actually been studies on this that have shown that teenagers in dating relationships, those relationships last longer if their parents disapproved of that relationship. In part because the parents disapproved, those teenagers wanted to prove to their parents that they can make their own choices, which led them to want to stick with their partner even more. And this concept that attempts to take away our freedoms can lead people to re-exert those freedoms is part of the reason why censorship can often backfire. So if you think of some organization telling you you can't read a certain book or you can't watch a certain movie or whatever, that tends to make people want to read that book or watch that movie even more. And the reason for that is due to psychological reactance, because we feel like someone else is taking away our freedom to choose to read that book or watch that movie, which makes us react against that perceived threat to our freedoms by making us want to do that thing even more. This idea of psychological reactance has been looked at in many studies. In one study, what some researchers did is they went into various public restrooms around the city, and they hung signs on those restroom walls. And they hung one of two signs. One of the signs in half the bathrooms said something like, please do not write on these walls. The other half of the signs that the other half of the bathrooms got said something like, under no circumstances should you ever write on these walls. And so what the researchers did is they left those signs there. They came back a couple weeks later, and they just looked to see how much graffiti had been put on those walls since those signs were put up. And what they showed is that there was more graffiti on the walls when the sign said, under no circumstances should you ever write on these walls, because people perceive that as trying to take away their freedom to choose to write on the walls, which they rebelled against because of psychological reactance by writing all over the walls, right? It's kind of like if you go into this public restroom and you see the sign that says, under no circumstances should you ever write on the walls, and you pull out a pen, you say, I'll show you, I'll write all over these walls if I want to. Right? That's what psychological reactance is. And what that means is that if you're trying to persuade someone of something, you need to understand that if you are presenting your position as taking away the audience's freedoms in some way, they'll often react against that, and your persuasion attempt might backfire. Okay, that's all I have for the persuasion section. I don't see any questions in chat. So what that means is let's have a quiz on Top Hat. So go into your Top Hat account, and we'll do that before we start the next section on compliance. And I'll give everybody a second to log into their account. And don't worry, I'll keep this first question up for a little longer, just to make sure everyone has time. All right, question number 1. In my lecture on persuasion, which I mostly gave last class, I discussed the most popular theory in social psychology explaining how people are persuaded is known as which of the following? And I'm seeing that no one is logged in. Why is that the case? Am I in the wrong section? Hold on. I'm in the wrong section. That is why. Okay, let me fix that. Sorry about that, guys. Oh, that's because I created 2 new sections. Okay, yeah. Okay, so it should be this one. Okay, there we go. While you guys answer this, I've got a barking dog I'm going to take care of. Give me 1 second. I'll be right back. Okay, you've got 10 seconds. 3, 2, 1. Okay, this one should be easy. I mentioned this at the beginning of this class. We talked all about it last class. The answer here is C, the elaboration likelihood model. Okay, so some of you need to review the last lecture, it looks like. But the elaboration likelihood model, otherwise known as the ELM, is the main theoretical model that we use to discuss how people are persuaded. Alexander, I've actually got two dogs. That one was a Maltese that was just barking. I've also got a Shih Tzu. Okay, question 2. Which of the following factors will tend to lead people to be on the central route to persuasion? What's going to lead them to be on the central route to persuasion? We got 10 seconds. 3, 2, 1. All right, so we talked about this last class. We talked about a couple of factors that can lead people to be on the central route to persuasion. The most important of those factors is if people find the issue relevant, which is just another way of saying that they're highly involved in the issue, which is why A is the correct answer. Okay, if you are highly involved in an issue, if an issue matters to you, then you're motivated to think about it in depth, which is what you do on the central route. Question 3. Fear appraisals, which we talked about last class, can be an effective way of persuading people. So this is where you scare people to try to change their opinions on something. But it's only effective if which of the following is true. We got 10 seconds. 3, 2, 1. All right, so excuse me. We talked about last class, so fear appraisals can be an effective way of persuading people, but only if they indicate how the fear can be or how the danger can be avoided. So if they say, so I gave you some examples of billboards that says something like cocaine doesn't make you sexy, it makes you dead. And if you just scare people, that's going to invoke sort of this cognitive dissonance, right? They're going to justify their behavior. But if you tell people how they can change their behavior, so if you need help, call this number, then that can be persuasive. People will often take that option. Question 4, I think. George does not like to think or analyze situations very much. So George is what, which according to the elaboration likelihood model tends to result in his being persuaded along which route to persuasion? Got 10 seconds. 3, 2, 1. All right, so we talked last class about an individual difference variable that relates to how much we like to think in a situation, and that's known as need for cognition. And so if George does not like to think very much, then we would say that he's low in need for cognition. So he doesn't really like to think. And if he doesn't like to think, then that means he's not going to be analyzing the arguments that are being presented to him, which means that he's on the peripheral route to persuasion, and that is option B. And finally, question 5, just simple true or false. Presenting messages subliminally is an effective way to influence people's behavior. Ten seconds. 3, 2, 1. All right, so we talked last class about subliminal messages. And we talked about how even though some people think that they can change people's behavior, in fact, studies have shown they do not. They're not effective at influencing people's behavior. And so that is false. All right, that was the last one, right? Yep. Okay, so new topic. We're still in the subcategory of social influence, how we're influenced by other people. And so far, we've looked at conformity, we've looked at persuasion, and we've got 2 more lectures to discuss in terms of social influence. The next one we're talking about is compliance. And so when we talked about persuasion, we weren't talking about people trying to change your behavior directly, right? They were trying to change your attitudes, maybe by making an argument for something, with the hope that that would change your behavior. But now when we talk about compliance, we're talking about more direct attempts to change people's behavior via requests. So if someone's directly requesting that you perform a certain behavior, then that falls under this idea of compliance. That's what we're going to be discussing. The biggest named researcher who has done work in compliance, his name is Robert Cialdini. Cialdini is an Italian name. And what he did is he wanted to know the principles of compliance, what are the strategies that people used, and what were the psychological principles on which those strategies were based to try to convince others to do something. And so to study this, what he did is he went undercover as a used car salesman for like 2 years, I think, something like that. So he learned from the other car salesmen what tactics and strategies they used to try to convince people to buy cars. And on the basis of those strategies, he developed 6 principles of compliance. We're going to talk about all 6 of those principles. Okay. In fact, he wrote a really, really good book. If you're interested in this sort of stuff, like how people try to manipulate you on like a day-to-day basis, he wrote a book called Influence, which is really fantastic. And there's all sorts of examples in there of stuff that people do to try to influence you. Really interesting book, I think. Whoops. In fact, we've seen compliance already in this class. So I'll come back to that in a second. On the very first day, I talked about this real world case where a guy by the name of Officer Scott, or he called himself Officer Scott, would call various fast food restaurants pretending to be a police officer, and he would try to convince them that someone was stealing money just to see what he can get away with. And so basically what he was trying to do, he was making direct requests of the managers of these restaurants and saying things like, you need to search through the purse of your employees to see if they have money. And by making those requests, he was trying to get them to comply, right? So that was an example of compliance when we talked about that. The author's name of that book was Cialdini. It's spelled C-I-A-L-D-I-N-I. Okay, that's C-I-A-L-D-I-N-I. And the book is called Influence. Okay. As we're going to see, a lot of the reasons why we tend to comply with people is based on this concept we talked about last class of mindlessness. Remember, the concept of mindlessness means that we're often not really motivated to think in depth. And so we behave mindlessly, which makes us susceptible to being influenced by these unimportant variables that don't even matter. And that same underlying principle holds in this compliance section. So we're going to see that there's all sorts of strategies that shouldn't influence us if we think about them logically, but that do influence us because we tend to behave mindlessly. And so the hope is that by making you aware of what these principles are, and this tendency that we all have to behave mindlessly, that maybe you'll be less susceptible to people trying to manipulate you in the future. So let's take a look at these principles. Here are the 6 compliance principles that I mentioned that Robert Cialdini came up with after going undercover. Okay, we're going to talk about each one of these in turn. Okay, so we're going to start with reciprocity and we'll work our way through the list. Reciprocity is the basic idea that we should treat others as they treat us. In other words, if you do someone a favor, they kind of owe you a favor to some extent, right? And if they do you a favor, you sort of owe them a favor. And there's a lot of good reasons. This is like an unwritten social norm kind of thing. And there's a lot of good reasons why this exists, right? We don't want people to be taking advantage of other people. And so we have this norm of reciprocity that tends to govern a lot of behavior. The problem is that although there's good reasons why that norm exists, people can take advantage of your tendency to want to repay a favor by making it seem as if they're doing you a favor and that therefore you owe them a favor back. And I'll give you some examples of what I mean in just a second. First off, I just want to describe a quick study, a simple study that looked at this norm of reciprocity in the first place. What some researchers did is they picked a bunch of names, 578 names randomly from a phone book. Just people I didn't know, just random names from a phone book. And they sent Christmas cards to those people. They said it's something basic like Merry Christmas from Bob and Sue or something like that. Okay, they just use some generic names. Okay. And what they did is they included their return address on the envelope. So they waited for a week or two just to see how many people would write back to them. And of those 578 people, about 20% of them, about 117 people, sent a card back in return, almost none of which mentioned that they had no idea who these people were. Right, so in other words, if you're one of these people, you received a Christmas card from a random couple, a stranger you've never met before, and our natural tendency is if they sent us a Christmas card, we owe them a Christmas card. So all these people sent Christmas cards back to these strangers. So that captures this norm of reciprocity that exists. I've seen this happen in many, many situations where I've got a friend who's getting married and they're trying to figure out, for instance, who they should invite to their wedding. And their logic sometimes as well. They invited me to their wedding last year, so I guess I should invite them as well. And that is that norm of reciprocity that we're talking about, right? So given that norm of reciprocity exists, there are certain specific techniques that people use that capitalize on that principle of reciprocity to try to convince you to do something, to try to manipulate you. And the first of these is something known as the door in the face technique. The door in the face technique is a simple technique. It's a two-step process. The first step is that the requester makes a really large request expecting to be turned down. Okay? In fact, the whole goal of that first request is not to get people to agree or to comply with them, but in fact was to get them to get turned down in the first place. And once they get turned down from that first large request, they then follow it up with a smaller request. And it turns out that people are more likely to agree to the smaller request if they had previously turned down a much larger request, compared to if they just had made that smaller request in the first place. So for instance, maybe you are driving your car and you're stopped at an intersection somewhere in Miami and someone comes up to you and you roll down your window and they say something like, hey, we're working for whatever organization. Would you be willing to donate $100 to this organization? And you say, no, you're not going to donate $100 to a random person on the street. And they say, okay, well, yeah, any dollar amount helps. So even $1 would help, right? Now, what happens is that because you've turned down that initial request, like they wanted $100 from you and you said no to them. And there's kind of that feeling of guilt, right? And so to get rid of that feeling of guilt, we become more likely to agree to that second request. Another way of thinking about this is that it kind of feels like the other person's doing you a favor, right? They wanted $100. They're willing to settle for $1. They're doing you a favor by dropping the magnitude of that request. And because they're doing you that favor, you often feel a need to return that favor, which you do by agreeing to that second request. And I'm seeing people mention that people do this in sales. Yeah, you're absolutely right. They absolutely do it in sales. And it's a way to manipulate you into thinking that they're doing you a favor. And I'll just describe to you a study that looked at this. In this study, researchers went up to random people and they asked them one of two questions depending on randomly assigned conditions. Okay. First off, people who were randomly assigned to the control condition were asked the following question. Would you be willing to serve as unpaid chaperones for juvenile delinquents on a day trip to the zoo? Okay. The other half of the people were approached by strangers and were asked the following question. Would you be willing to serve as unpaid counselors to juvenile delinquents for 2 hours a week for 2 years? Okay, 2 hours a week, that's about, for 2 years, is about 200 hours. So would you be willing to volunteer 200 hours of your time to work with juvenile delinquents? And as you can imagine, everyone says no to this, right? That's just way too large of a request. And then once people say no to this large request, the researchers follow it up with the following request. No? Okay, well then would you be willing to serve as unpaid chaperones for juvenile delinquents on a day trip to the zoo? Which is the exact request that people in the control group got. So what they're doing is they're testing to see whether if you ask people this really large request and then turn you down, are they more likely to agree to the real request, the day trip to the zoo request, compared to if they were never asked that initial large request in the first place. Okay. And so this is the percentage of people who agreed to that request to go to the zoo, that second request with these juvenile delinquents. When there was no large first request, so in the control condition, only about 17% of people, about 1 out of 6 or so, agreed to go on a day trip to the zoo with these juvenile delinquents. But if people had initially turned down that really, really large request and were only then asked if they were willing to take a day trip to the zoo, the number roughly triples to about 50% of people. So people become much more willing to agree to go to the zoo with these juvenile delinquents if they just turn down that initial request. Again, because it felt like the requester wanted something and then didn't get what they wanted, so did them a favor by dropping the magnitude of that request. And so these participants sort of felt a need to return that favor, which they did by agreeing to that second request. And yeah, Joanna, of course, that people could be, more or less likely to agree to a request depending on how they feel on any given day. That's true. However, remember that in these studies, people are randomly assigned to conditions. And so on average, people will be in the same mood on average across those two conditions. So that gets canceled out in these experimental studies. This is from the comic strip Calvin and Hobbes. Calvin says, "Mom, can I set fire to my bed mattress?" She says, "No, Calvin." Just, "Can I ride my tricycle on the roof?" "No, Calvin." But what Calvin was doing is he didn't really want to do those things. He was just setting her up for the real request. And his real request then is, "Can I have a cookie?" But his mom has taken social psychology. She knows that he's using the door in the face technique. And so she says, "No, Calvin." And he says, "She's on to me." So what Calvin's doing here is the classic door in the face technique, right? Making large requests that he knows are going to be turned down. And it's because they're being turned down that he thinks he's more likely to get her to agree to the real request that he wanted, which is to have a cookie. And there are all sorts of examples of people who use things like the door in the face technique in general. I'll give you a couple examples, or just in general, the principle of reciprocity. I personally hate grocery shopping. I just find it's a tiring chore that I've done like hundreds of times, and it's so boring that it drives me crazy, right? But the one thing I do like about shopping is when people are giving out free samples, right? That's like the highlight of any shopping trip, are the free samples people are giving out. But if you're anything like me, you can't just make a beeline to the free samples. That looks a little too obvious. You have to be a little more coy. You have to be a little more subtle. So you kind of pretend to walk by, and you're kind of waiting for them to call you over and like, oh yeah, I didn't even see you there. Let me, yeah, maybe I would like a free sample. It's all this big game. I don't know why we do this. I do this all the time. In any case, what they'll do is they'll give you a free sample. And then once you have it, a lot of the times what they'll do is they'll say things like, well, we have like if maybe it's a cracker or something. Well, we have a whole box of crackers here. If you'd like to purchase it, they're right here, right? And again, if you're anything like me, I can't just say no. Like I didn't want to buy the product. I just wanted the free sample, but I can't just say no. So I have to make excuses. Well, actually, yeah, it's a good product. I'll think about it. I'm going to walk around a little bit, but I'll think about it. Maybe I'll come back. And I don't know why I have to say all that. I could just say no, right? The person who's giving you the free samples, they don't care if you buy something. They're not working on commission. They don't make money every time they sell a product necessarily, right? They don't really care if you buy the product or not. So why is it that we feel a need to make all these excuses for why we're not buying their product? And part of the reason for that is because, in a sense, we're sort of violating this norm of reciprocity, right? I mean, they did something for us. They gave us a free sample. And we feel this need to return that favor. And when we don't return that favor by buying their product, we sort of feel guilty. So we have to make all these excuses, right? So part of the reason why supermarkets and other places will give free samples is not only to expose you to the product, oh, that's one reason, but also because by making it seem like they're doing you a favor, you'll often feel a need to return the favor by buying that very product, so they actually make more money. So that relies on this principle of reciprocity. And I think it's the season 1 DVDs of the show Family Guy. Seth MacFarlane, who's the creator of the show, is giving like a writer's or director's commentary. And he mentions one of the strategies that he uses when writing some episode of the show where he thinks the censors aren't going to allow him to put in the jokes that he wants to put in. And what he says is that whenever he has a joke that he thinks the censors, like the network censors, aren't going to allow him to put in, what he'll do is he'll write the episode with all sorts of raunchy jokes that he knows for sure the censors are going to say no to. But he does that strategically, because when he presents that show and he gives it to the network and the censors say, no, you can't put all these jokes in here, that's way over the top. Then what he'll do is he'll say, okay, well, I'll take out these jokes, but can I just leave this one single joke in, which is the only joke he actually wanted to get in the episode anyway. But what happens is that because it feels like Seth MacFarlane has done the censors a favor by removing all of these other sort of raunchy jokes that they wouldn't let in, the censors become more likely to agree to allow him to keep that one joke in, right? So he's very strategic in this. He's effectively using the door in the face technique. He's making this really large request, getting turned down, and then making the smaller request, which is the request he really wanted in the first place. And the censors become much more likely to agree to it. In fact, I would say that the door in the face technique was effectively responsible for bringing down the most potentially, or arguably, the most powerful person in the world, which was the American president a few decades ago. And we talk about Richard Nixon and the Watergate scandal. So just to give you a little background on this, this is when Richard Nixon, president at the time, was running for re-election, and a committee that was working for his re-election campaign basically bugged the offices of the Democrats at the Watergate Hotel. Okay, it was this huge scandal. And quickly, this conspiracy to bug the Democrats started to unravel. And Richard Nixon himself and people working for him were continuously denying their involvement in this conspiracy, even though it was becoming increasingly clear that there was a conspiracy that was actually happening on a presidential scale. Eventually, it got to the point where Nixon had to resign his office in disgrace, basically, as a consequence of the Watergate scandal. And that's kind of the basic outline of the story that a lot of people know. But there's a part of the story that a lot of people don't know, which is exactly why it was the case that the committee decided to bug the offices in the first place. Because it turns out that doing so was not just kind of dumb, but it was like exceedingly stupid to do so. And I'm not just making that up. The people on the committee themselves afterwards said, how could we have been so stupid with this plan? Well, I'm going to tell you how they were this stupid, okay? Here's what happened. There's a guy by the name of G. Gordon Liddy, and he came to this committee and he said, I have an idea to help with Nixon's re-election plan. Here's what I'm proposing. If you give me $1 million, here's what I'm going to do, okay? I'm going to get these spy planes that are going to track the Democrats wherever they go. And I'm going to get a bunch of yachts, and I'm going to invite Democrats onto the yachts. I'm going to get a bunch of escorts and call girls, and so we can blackmail them. And I've got this wiretapping sabotage thing, and we're going to tap the offices, or we're going to bug the offices of the Watergate Hotel. And the committee heard all this, and they said, that is absolutely insane. We're not doing any of that. So G. Gordon Liddy leaves, and he comes back a little while later, and he says, okay, I'll tell you what. For $500,000, here's what I'm going to, I'll get rid of the spy planes idea. I'll get rid of like the mugging part of the plan, but I want to keep the yacht and the call girls, and we'll blackmail the Democrats, and I want to bug the offices of the Watergate Hotel. And again, the committee looks at him and says, you're absolutely insane. We're not doing that at all. So G. Gordon Liddy comes back a third time and he says, okay, my final offer for $250,000, I'll get rid of spy planes. I'll get rid of the yacht. I'll get rid of the wiretapping and all this sort of, all I want to do is bug the offices of the Democrats at the Watergate Hotel. And the committee looked at him and said, okay. What happened here was effectively what G. Gordon Liddy had done was he used the door in the face technique. Now, he may not have intended to do that when he first started this, But effectively, that's what happened. He went in with this really large request, right? Give me $1 million and I'll get you a spy plane and yachts and call girls and muggings and wiretapping and bugging the offices. And he got rejected, and he came back with a smaller request, and the committee agreed to it. And so later on, when the people in the committee were being interviewed as to why they agreed to this plan, they said something like the following: after starting at the grandiose sum of $1 million, we thought that probably $250,000 would be an acceptable figure. We were reluctant to send him away with nothing. But why were they reluctant to send him away with nothing? Well, it's because he had, in their eyes, he had done them a favor, right? He came in asking for $1 million. He's willing to settle for $250,000. He had dropped his request. That kind of feels like he's making a concession. He's doing us on the committee a favor, and they felt a need to return that favor. And I'm not just speculating. Here's another quote from these people which basically give such a great verbal description of the door in the face technique. They said the following: if he had come to us at the outset and said, I have a plan to burglarize and wiretap Larry O'Brien's office, we might have rejected the idea out of hand. Instead, he came to us with his elaborate call girl, kidnapping, mugging, sabotage, wiretapping scheme. He had asked for the whole oaf, and he was quite content to settle for half or even a quarter. And that's exactly right. What they're saying is that if he had come to us at the beginning and made the small request, we would have rejected the idea. But instead, he came to us with a large request, which we turned down, which made us more likely to agree to the smaller request, which is basically the door in the face technique in a nutshell. Okay. And so that is how not understanding the social psychological principle of the door in the face technique led to the resignation of the most powerful man in the world. Okay, so we've been talking about the first principle, the principle of reciprocity. A second principle is the principle known as commitment and consistency, which is in effect something we've sort of already seen before. Because the principle of commitment and consistency says that once we make a commitment, we feel pressure to behave consistently with that commitment. We've seen this before effectively when we looked at cognitive dissonance, right? Because we've seen that when we say one thing and we do the opposite, that creates this negative feeling, that cognitive dissonance, which we then are motivated to reduce. And so when we make a verbal commitment to something, we tend to want to behave consistently with that commitment so that we avoid experiencing that cognitive dissonance in the first place. So this is very much related to that idea. But what that means is that the people who are trying to manipulate you know this. And so they will often try to get you to commit to something verbally, which makes you more likely to follow through with that commitment and perform some behavior later on. And I'll give you some examples of this. So in this first study, what researchers did, simple study, they went to a beach, okay? Then they found a person who was on a towel somewhere, and they laid their towel pretty close to them, kind of next to them a little bit. Okay? And they took out a radio, they put the radio on their blanket, on their towel, I should say, and they just hang out there for a few minutes. And about 5 minutes in, the researcher got up and left. And as they left, they randomly assigned the person who was sitting beside them, who didn't know they were part of the study, but they randomly assigned them to one of two conditions. And the control group, the researcher simply stood up and walked off and didn't say anything to that unwitting participant. But in the critical experimental condition, what the researcher did is before leaving, they turned to the person beside them and said, "Excuse me, would you please watch my things?" And you've likely been asked that before by a stranger. If you're at like a coffee shop or something, someone asks you, "Hey, I'm going to the bathroom, can you watch my computer?" or something, right? And we all just say yes to this when that happens. So they always said yes. So the researcher gets up and walks away. About 5 minutes later, another person walking down the beach sees this towel and a radio, and there's no one there. And they look around and they grab the radio and they take off. Now, obviously, that person's working with the experimenter. And what they want to know is, will the person who is seated beside the researcher, would that participant chase after the radio thief? And that's what I'm going to show you on this next slide here. Or do I have the slide? Yeah. This is the percentage of people who intervened. In other words, the percentage of people who chased after the person who stole the radio. Now, in the control condition, these are the people who were never asked to watch the person's things. Almost every single person just like watched it watch this guy run away, right? Like only 20% of people did anything. The vast majority of people just watched the thief run off with the radio. But in the condition in which people were initially asked, would you please watch my things, to which they had agreed, that number jumps from 20% to 95%. 95% of these people, they did this 20 times in that condition, 19 out of 20 people in that condition chased after the guy who just stole this radio. In one condition, one of the participants actually tackled him into the sand. They had to like immediately stop the study, obviously, right? This is an absolutely enormous effect. And why is that actually occurring? Well, because these people had previously agreed that, yes, I will watch your things. They had made a verbal commitment, even if they hadn't really thought through the implications of that commitment, right? They just had agreed that I will watch their things. So when the radio thief comes and steals the radio, they've got to behave consistently with that commitment. So they chase after them. And there's lots of other examples of this as well. So here's another one. Telephone solicitors, so people who would like cold call people, right, and try to get them to donate money to, you know, some organization or a charity or whatever it is. There was a simple strategies that a lot of these people worked, and it was so subtle that people had no idea it was even a tactic. They had no idea that even a strategy was being used on them, but it was quite effective. Here's what they would do. Okay, here's how simple this was. So you can imagine that you get a random call from a number, you answer the phone and that person says, hello, Mr. or Mrs., whatever your name is, how are you doing today? And you say, I'm fine. And at that point, they've got you. You just think they're making idle chit chat by asking you how you're doing, but they're not. What they're doing is they're getting you to commit to the fact that you're doing okay. Because once you say that you're fine, they say something like, well, that's great to hear that you're doing okay, because there's some other people who are not doing as well as you are, and they need your help. And you see they've trapped you, right? Because when a stranger asks you how you're doing, you're not going to tell them, you're not going to go into all your medical history, right? So if a stranger asks you how you're doing, you're not going to say, well, my elbow's been bothering me recently, right? We all just say fine. It's a mindless response that we give. We're fine. We're doing okay. But by doing so, we're committing to that idea that we're fine. And if we're doing fine and these other people aren't, then maybe we should help them out. And research has shown that if you get people, strangers, to just say that they're doing fine, they become more likely to donate money to that cause later on. Toy companies have used this strategy before. I think this is kind of a genius idea, I think. Because toy companies had a problem, right? Here's their problem. They were able to sell a lot of toys in the lead up to Christmas, right? Obviously, a lot of people are buying toys prior to Christmas. However, their problem was that they wouldn't sell a lot of toys in January because all the parents of kids bought all their toys in December, right, for Christmas. So the sales were slumping in January. So they needed to figure out a way, how do we boost toy sales in January? And what they came up with was this really interesting strategy. Here's what they would do. So on certain Christmas seasons, there would be a toy that they would generate a lot of buzz about, that everyone wanted this one toy. This has happened with numerous types of toys in the past. Somewhat famously, Tickle Me. This happened with Tickle Me Elmos, with what is that? Furbies, with Beanie Babies, with Cabbage Patch Dolls in the 80s. This has happened time and time again, where there's this toy where everyone wants this toy. But what the toy companies would do is they would deliberately understock that toy, which at first doesn't seem to make sense, right? If everyone wants this toy, wouldn't you sell more toys by having more of those toys available? Like, why would you deliberately understock? But what they would do, this is so genius, because what would happen is that parents of these kids were saying, hey, can you buy me this Tickle Me Elmo? And the parents would say, yes, you know, if you're good for Christmas, I will get you a Tickle Me Elmo. They're basically verbally committing to their child, I will buy you a Tickle Me Elmo. Then they would go shopping before Christmas and they can't find a Tickle Me Elmo anywhere. There's just none to be found. But they can't get their kid nothing for Christmas. So they buy some replacement gift, right? And they give that gift, that toy, to their kid. And then lo and behold, right after Christmas happens, there's a huge shipment and all these Tickle Me Elmos come in. And now what happens? All these parents who had promised their kids Tickle Me Elmos before Christmas, but were unable to get them, go back to the toy store and they buy a Tickle Me Elmo in January to give to their kid. And why did they do that? Because they had verbally committed to their kid that they were going to do that. So what the toy companies basically did is they sold parents 2 toys instead of 1, right? And they basically were able to do that because these parents had verbally committed to their children that they were going to buy that toy, and they felt this need to behave consistently with that past commitment. So first off, that's the door in the face technique, or I should say, sorry, let me back up. What I meant to say is that a technique that's based on the principle of commitment and consistency is something known as the foot in the door technique, which is not to be confused with the door in the face technique, okay? Because they both have the word door in them, people confuse them. So just make sure you got that straight. Door in the face technique is based on the principle of reciprocity. Foot in the door technique is based on the principle of commitment and consistency. And the foot in the door technique is basically the opposite of the door in the face technique. It's a two-step strategy. What the person does is the requester first gets someone to comply with a small request. And then once they've agreed to that small request, they then make a larger request. Now, as long as that second larger request is conceptually similar to the smaller request, as long as the larger request is similar to the smaller request, people become much more likely to agree to that second larger request if they had first agreed to that small request. And I'll give you an example of how this works as well. Okay, this is what I've called the Drive Carefully study. So what some researchers did is they went to a bunch of houses around a neighborhood, and they rang the doorbell. When the person answered, they would say, "Hey, we're from the committee to drive carefully," or something like that. And we're wondering if you would do us a favor. We've got this billboard. We would like to put that in your front lawn to encourage people to drive carefully. And they show the homeowner what the billboard looks like. And it's this god-awful, ugly thing, right? It's this giant billboard. It's got this really bright paint, really ugly lettering. It just says drive carefully, just splashed on it. It's like really gaudy and really not a pleasant thing to look at. Okay. Now, what the homeowners don't know is that half of them, about 2 weeks earlier, had been approached by a different person who claimed to be from the same committee, and 2 weeks earlier, that person had asked them if they would be willing to put a 2-inch by 2-inch sticker in their front window that said, drive carefully. Now, when they had done that, everyone who had been approached agreed. It's not a big deal. You put a little 2-inch sticker in your window, big deal, right? So everyone had agreed to that smaller request. So what the researchers want to know is, will the people who had agreed to put the sticker in their window 2 weeks earlier, will they be more likely to agree to put a billboard, this ugly billboard in their front lawn, compared to people who had never agreed to that initial small request? And that's what I'm showing you here. So in the control condition, these are the people who had never agreed, who had never been asked to put a sticker in their window. Only about 18% of them or so agreed to put this ugly billboard in their front lawn. But if people had previously been approached and been asked to put a small sticker in their window and they had agreed to that, then suddenly the number of people who agree, or the percentage of people who agree to put this ugly billboard in their front lawn, jumps to 76%. It roughly quadrupled the likelihood that people would agree to that request. Now, why is that the case? Well, the way that I like to think about this is sort of through the person's self-concept. So what happens is, like, if someone comes up to you and they ask you to put a little sticker in your window that says drive carefully, and you agree to do so, that sort of becomes part of your self-concept, right? I apparently am someone who believes in safe driving because I put that sticker in the window. So when a couple weeks later, someone comes along and says, would you be willing to put this billboard in your front lawn? Well, that's very much consistent with this new self-concept I've developed for myself, that I'm very pro-safe driving, right? And because it's consistent, I'm someone who believes in safe driving. So yeah, of course I'll agree to put that billboard in there. So effectively what happened is that by agreeing to a small request, it changes the person's self-concept, their beliefs about who they are, which makes them more likely to agree to things that are consistent with that changed self-concept. So you can see how it's built on this principle of commitment and consistency. Once someone commits to a certain idea they have about themselves, I'm a pro-safe driving type of person, they become more likely to agree to larger requests that are similar in nature. I just see some people have some questions here. So for the door in the face technique, the first request can have nothing to do with the final request, right? So we're not talking about foot in the door, we're talking about door in the face technique. So Yeah, the sort of, yeah, more or less. If you make a really large request, all that's required for the door in the face technique to work is that the requester, it feels like they're doing you a favor. So it almost always is going to be related. The big request and the normal request are going to be related to each other because usually the requester is just dropping the magnitude of the request. So it doesn't necessarily have to have anything to do with the final request, but it in practical purposes, it usually does. How do you know to use the foot in the door versus door in the face? You mean if you're trying to get someone to comply with you? I mean, they're just various techniques. You can do either one, right? Either one would potentially theoretically work. It'll probably depend on the specifics of what the request actually is. There's probably certain requests that'll work better for door in the face versus foot in the door, but theoretically they would both work. And then so the idea is that they want to stick with what their self-concept tells them what they believe in. Yeah, you can kind of think of it like self-perception theory, right? So when this person comes and says, would you be willing to put this billboard in your front lawn? You can kind of think like the person's thinking, well, let's see, what is my opinion on safe driving? Well, a couple of weeks ago, I agreed to put a sticker in the window that says I'm pro-safe driving. So I guess I am pro-safe driving, right? That's self-perception theory. People are coming to a rational inference about what their attitude is by thinking about their past behavior. And therefore, if I'm pro-safe driving, this is consistent with my new self-concept, so I'm more likely to agree to it. Okay, so that's one technique, the foot in the door technique, that's based on this principle of commitment and consistency, but it's not the only one. There's a second technique as well. And this is kind of, I think, the shadiest of these techniques, as you'll see. Yeah, Melissa, yeah, let me just explain one more time, just so everyone's on the same page. So in the foot in the door technique, you make a small request, then you increase the magnitude of the request. For the door in the face technique, you make a really large request, then you come down and ask for a smaller request. So the difference is just which one you ask first. Small to big is foot in the door, big to small is door in the face. Okay. Lowballing is a little bit different than those other ones, though, although it's still a two-step process. But here's how lowballing works, okay? So if you're the one who's lowballing someone else, then what you would do is you get them to agree to something. Maybe you're selling them a car, and you get them to agree. You're going to buy the car for $20,000, okay? That's the price. And once they agree to that price, you then reveal these hidden costs. Okay, so the car's $20,000, but with taxes and tag fees and this fee and that fee, dealership fees and destination fee, it's actually $24,000, right? But you don't mention those hidden costs right away. You only wait until the person has agreed to the initial request, $20,000, and only then do you reveal the hidden costs. And what happens is that because the person has already agreed to that initial request, they become more likely to agree to pay those hidden costs. Let me describe to you a study that looked at this first off. This is a study where researchers called people and they said something like the following. So imagine you're a participant, right? So imagine you get a phone call from me and I say, so I know you're in my introduction to social psychology class. I know as part of that class, you need to do some extra credit. I've got a study. We're looking for participants. Okay, it's at 7 a.m. this Saturday. Would you be willing to participate? And if you're like most people, I imagine most of you are going to say, hell no, I'm not participating in a study at 7 a.m. on a Saturday. That's crazy, right? So you probably are going to reject me right away. But that's what I do for half of you. For the other half of you, you're in the lowball condition. So what I do is I call you up and I say, hey, I know you're in my introduction to social psychology class and you can use some extra credit. I've got a study that we need some participants. Would you be willing to participate? And then once you say, yes, I would like to participate, then I say, great, it's this Saturday at 7 a.m. Now, what the researchers want to know, of course, is are people more likely to agree to go to that 7 a.m. study if they agreed to go to a study and only then were the hidden costs revealed that it's at 7 a.m. on Saturday? And in fact, that's exactly what they found, is that among people who were told right away the study's at 7 a.m. on Saturday, almost no one agrees to that. But among the other people who agreed to participate in a study, and then only once they agreed did the researchers tell them it's at 7 a.m. on Saturday, they were much, much more likely to continue to behave consistently with that commitment and still do that study. In fact, the researchers who were a little bit mean here, they kept up the ruse. So they actually went on 7 a.m. on Saturday to see if the participants would actually show up. And in fact, A lot of them did in that condition. They still tended to show up. And this technique of lowballing, we see it all over the place. Here's one place you see it, and this drives me crazy, okay? And maybe it drives you crazy as well. And that's if you buy like concert tickets on Ticketmaster, okay? They do this all the time. They do this on all sorts of websites, but Ticketmaster, I feel like is particularly bad with this, is that they'll advertise a price of a concert, right? This concert, you can get tickets for $29.99. And you think, wow, what a great deal. I would love to go see this band for $29.99. So you go online and you enter all your credit card information and you do all this stuff and you go through multiple pages. And then right on the checkout page, right before you hit the final submit button, it says, okay, well, the total cost is actually $45 because there's a convenience fee and there's taxes and there's all these other fees as well, right? But they didn't tell you about those fees at the beginning. They told you just the price of the ticket was $30. And only after you agreed and you put all your credit card information in and you clicked your way through multiple pages, only then do they reveal those hidden costs. And a lot of websites do that. And what they're effectively doing is lowballing you. They purposefully did not tell you about those hidden costs up front because they know that if they did, you may not have agreed to buy those tickets. But if they tell you the tickets are only $30 and then you go through all this effort, you enter your credit card information, you've kind of committed yourself to buying those tickets, which makes you more likely to agree to those hidden costs. I mean, after all, you're only $15 away from actually getting those tickets. So you're more likely to agree to those additional $15. Okay. Online companies will do this to you all the time. You'll see this happen constantly. I'm going to show you a clip from the movie Fargo from, I think it's 96. So this guy, his name is Jerry Lundegaard. And Jerry Lundegaard is a used car salesman, and he's in the process of lowballing a couple of his customers right now. The audio should work for you. Let me know in the chat if it doesn't, but I think it should work. So take a look at what he does to lowball his customers.
Right here in this room and went over this and over this.
Yeah, but that True Coat.
I sat right here and said I didn't want any True Coat.
Yeah, but I'm saying that True Coat, you don't get it, you get oxidation problems. It'll cost you a heck of a lot more than $500.
You're sitting there, you're talking in circles, you're talking like we didn't go over this already.
Yeah, but this True Coat.
We had a deal here for $19.5. You sat there and darned if you didn't tell me you'd get me this car, these options, without the sealant for $19.5.
All right, I'm not saying I didn't.
You called me 20 minutes ago and said you had it ready to make delivery. It says, come on down and get it. And here you are, and you're wasting my time and my wife's time, and I'm paying $19.5 for this vehicle here.
All right. I'll talk to my boss. See, they install that True Coat at the factory. There's nothing we can do. But I'll talk to my boss.
These guys here, these guys, it's always the same. It's always more.
You going to the Gophers on Sunday?
Oh, you betcha.
You wouldn't have an extra ticket.
You kidding?
Well, he never done this before. But seeing as it's special circumstances and all, he says I can knock $100 off that True Coat.
100. You lied to me, Mr. Lundgaard. You're a bald-faced liar. A fucking liar. Where's my goddamn checkbook? Let's get this over with. Where is it?
All right, so he actually used two different techniques there, right? He used lowballing. He got the customer to agree to buy the car at $19,500, and only once he agreed did he then later reveal these hidden costs. You have to pay an additional $500 for this True Coat, right? But he didn't tell him that straight away because he knew he'd be less likely to buy the car at the time. So he lowballed him in that sense. The second thing he did is that he effectively used the door in the face technique. So he asked for this True Coat is $500. Then he went to talk to his boss. Of course, he wasn't actually talking to his boss. He pretended he did. And then he came back and said, well, I'll tell you what, he just did you a favor, special circumstances. He knocked $100 off that True Coat. And so it felt like they were doing the customer a favor. We knocked $100 off just for you, right? Which makes the customer more willing, more likely to agree to that second request. So it's kind of a combination of door in the face with lowballing. All right, so we've seen two principles, right? Reciprocity and commitment and consistency. A third compliance principle is the principle of social proof, which again is kind of like something we've seen before. Because here's how social proof is defined. We tend to view a behavior as correct to the degree that we see others performing it. This is very, very much related to conformity. In particular, when we talked about informational influence, remember? Informational influence says that we will conform if we believe that other people are correct in their judgments. And so we think a behavior is correct if we see other people performing it. And that's basically what social proof is. The thing is that the people who try to manipulate you can manipulate your sense of social proof in various different ways. And I'll give you a few examples of how they do that. In other words, they can create sort of a false social proof. They can lead you to believe that everyone's doing something, even if they're not. And if you think everyone else is doing this thing, then you're more likely to do it as well. So effectively, they manipulate that social proof for you. Now, I say that it is often accurate, right? And I mentioned this when we talk about informational influence. The reason we rely on informational influence when deciding whether to conform is because sometimes it is accurate. Sometimes we do want to know what everyone else is doing. I used an example when we talked about conformity, where if you're staying at a hotel and an alarm goes off in the middle of the night, you're in a country, you don't speak the language, you don't know what the alarm means. If everyone's running out of the building, you should probably run out of the building, right? It would be a good thing to look to other people to figure out what to do. However, if we over rely on social proof, it makes us susceptible to being taken advantage of. So here's some examples. I tend to hate sitcoms with just a couple exceptions. And when I say sitcoms, I mean the sitcoms with a laugh track. I really, really hate laugh tracks. If you think about it for a second, they don't make any sense, right? Like two people are in an apartment alone having a conversation and one person makes a joke and suddenly 50 people are laughing. Like, where do those 50 people come from? Like, doesn't it take us out of the realism that's supposed to be created by that TV show? So why is it that there is this fake laughter that is put into these shows? And usually that laughter, it can either be like electronically added or digitally added, or you might have a live studio audience who are basically told to applaud at certain points. So what the television companies are doing is basically manipulating social proof. They're making it seem like this joke is really funny. And that's exactly why they use it. Because we tend to think a joke is funnier if we hear other people laughing compared to if we don't hear other people laughing. So people tend to think sitcoms are funnier when laugh tracks are used versus when they're not. In fact, you could test this for yourself. If you go to YouTube, you could search for shows with laugh track removed. I think you can do this with like the Big Bang Theory and some other shows. You just do a search for like Big Bang Theory, laugh track removed, something like that. And it'll show you a scene from that show without a laugh track. And if you compare them, if you watch those scenes back to back, one with the laugh track as it was originally created and one without the laugh track, they're very different experiences. Like when the laugh track isn't there, those jokes aren't really funny. In fact, it's really awkward and strange watching it. And that's because, again, we tend to view a behavior as correct to the extent that we see others performing it. When we hear other people laughing, it's like it tells us, here's where you should laugh. And it tends to make us think the joke is funnier than if the laugh track is not there. At least that's true when the jokes are kind of corny or kind of bad. So that kind of relies on the principle of social proof. Here's another example where you see social proof. So if you work in the service industry where you get tips, especially if you were working as like a bartender or something like that, here's a tip for you, okay? If you want to make more money, here's what you should do. If you've got a tip jar, before your shift, put a few dollars of your own money in that tip jar, as opposed to leaving it empty. And the reason why is the following. Let's imagine I'm a customer and I go to you, let's say you're a bartender, and I go and order a drink from you. And then I'm trying to figure out, wait, should I tip this person? And I look at the tip jar. And if the tip jar is empty, that's telling me that no one else is tipping. And if no one else is tipping, maybe I don't have to. But if I look at a tip jar and there's a bunch of ones in there, then I'm thinking, oh, everyone else is tipping, I should tip as well. And so by putting a few of your own dollars in a tip jar, you will make more money because it convinces the other people that the correct behavior is to be tipping. And so if you work in an industry with a tip jar, don't take the money out throughout the day. That's what I've heard some people do. But if you take the money out, you're discouraging people from tipping. So keep the money in there. And again, that's based on the principle of social proof. Okay, I'm actually going to skip over this one, the Doomsday Cult one. This takes a little bit too long to explain. I'm saying I don't really have enough time, and it's kind of it's not exactly the best example of social proof. So forget about this. I'm not going to ask any questions about this. Here's another example. This was when plays were being performed. This is in Europe. So just like we know, when we watch sitcoms with a laugh track, we know the laugh track is composed of people who are like told to laugh, right? Like it's not really a genuine reaction. They're being told to laugh, or it's being digitally input or something. In the same way, when plays were put on in like the 1800s and stuff, there were people who were paid to go to these plays and laugh and clap. They were paid to do that, right? Just like people are told to laugh at a laugh track. And the thing, and this is one of the menu cards from one of the companies that would, this is how much they would charge the theater companies, right? So if you want to hire one of our people and you want them to applaud when a gentleman enters, there's a certain price. And if you want them to give insistent applause, there's another price. And if you want wild enthusiasm, we can arrange that as well. And they would sell their services. And the thing is, the audience members knew that there were people in the audience who were paid to laugh and clap and be enthusiastic. But the thing is with social proof, and the thing is with a lot of these techniques, is that even when you know you're being manipulated, you still may fall for it. It still tends to influence us. Just like even though we know that canned laughter, the laugh track on a sitcom is sort of fake, it still makes the joke seem funnier. And just as these people, even though they knew they were people who were paid to clap and yell out during the performance, it still made the performance seem better to them, because social proof works even when we know it's being used against us at that moment. Okay, I'll give you one more example. This is a study that looked at the suicide rate, and in particular, it looked at the change in the suicide rate from what's expected. So what it can do is for, let's say, the month of November, we can predict how many suicides we would expect next month in November based on how many suicides there were last November. And if there are more suicides, then we would see a positive number on the x-axis or on the y-axis here. And if there were fewer suicides than expected, we'd see a negative number. So this doesn't mean there were negative suicides. This means there were, in this case, 200 fewer suicides than would be expected. Okay, that's what this graph is showing. And what they did is they looked at the change in the expected suicide rate, or and how many suicides there were, as a function of whether there was a highly publicized suicide. So like a celebrity killed themselves, for instance. And what they showed is that if you've got a celebrity who commits suicide, then the month of that story, the month that that suicide happens, and the month after that suicide happens, that's highly publicized, there's a huge jump in the suicide rate, right? There's an additional 1,400 suicides the month of the story, and an additional 800 suicides the month following the story. This means that there's effectively 2,200 suicides that wouldn't have happened had it not been for this highly publicized suicide. So like 2,200 people, more people kill themselves, presumably because of this highly publicized story, who wouldn't have killed themselves had it not been for that celebrity killing themselves. And the reason for this is explained in terms of social proof, because you might have someone who is maybe depressed and they're thinking about committing suicide. They're not sure if they want to do it. And then they see this highly publicized suicide. And because we view a behavior as correct to the extent that we see others performing it, if we see other people committing suicide in a highly publicized format, that might be enough to convince us to commit suicide. Now, that's not going to affect people who weren't predisposed to thinking about committing suicide in the first place, right? I'm only talking about people who were considering it in the first place. But that highly publicized story might be the straw that breaks the camel's back, basically. It might be the thing that leads people to commit suicide because of social proof. Okay, it's 1:15, so I'm going to end things here. So again, I'm going to send out an email probably either tonight or tomorrow with a link for Thursday's lecture. And I'm also going to send out a link to this lecture once I get it uploaded on YouTube. Okay, so again, Thursday's lecture, again, going to be online in Zoom, and then we're going to be back in class on Tuesday. All right, thanks everybody, and have a great night. I'll see you on Thursday.